Very often, there are builds hiding in plain sight, waiting for one more buff or one more nerf to become dominant in the meta. Today, I'm going to try to call out some of those behemoths lurking just below the surface, with 3 builds that all have the potential to completely shake up the meta in 320, 321, or beyond. Like with all predictions, this may and may not come true. But one thing's for sure, you'll learn a lot about how to build characters in Path of Exile, and what the difference is between a successful build and an unsuccessful one. So buckle up, get subscribed, and let's take a look at what builds might just destroy the meta. As of 320, Flicker Strike got a lot of buffs. So many buffs in fact, that it's the best melee skill. With Vol Flicker Strike, you hit harder than any other melee ability in Path of Exile, you hit harder than spells, and let's be honest, walking is for plebs when you can just teleport to targets. Flicker Strike is the secret meta-destroying build. That's right, you've caught me. And alright, this would have been funny if it was April Fool's. This is in fact not one of the builds that I think is going to take over the meta, because Flicker very much has a love it or hate it playstyle. Most people who are playing Flicker have been doing so for the past 20 leagues, and almost everyone else will never play Flicker even if it's the best skill in the game. But hey, with all Flicker Strike, it's stronger than it used to be. The real first build that may take over the meta is Cold Dot Ascendant. And this is because we're already seeing a lot of very skilled players playing it in hardcore. Right here, you have Uberdan, and just below him you have Waggle. Of course, Creeping Frost has been strong for a really long time, but Creeping Frost is exactly the sort of skill, or Cold Dot more broadly, that gains a lot from the recent changes. Not only can you scale it with Eye of Malice, causing nearby enemies to have 50% increased resistances, multiplies their resistances by 1.5. If that number is negative, it makes it more negative, and if it's positive, it makes it more positive. With curses being stronger than ever, picking up a +1 curse via Doedri's Damning is pretty much the obvious play. This is a 3-curse build, and the Restless Vortex is really interesting. It's something that I'd never personally considered, but I can absolutely see the value. If you're wondering, is this just a fluke? Does Dan just happen to have one with socketed AoE gems? No, it's not a fluke, because Waggle's using the exact same thing. And with 4% movement speed per frenzy charge, regenerate 75 life per endurance charge, I see the appeal. With around 180% increased charge duration, you're going to have those charges up for a really long time. The other advantage of playing Ascendant is you're very flexible with your tree. One thing that surprises me here is Wind Dancer. Personally, I still feel like this is kind of a bait, but Dan isn't dead and Waggle isn't dead, so maybe I've underestimated it. Cold Dot has long been a go-to for hardcore. It's an especially safe bosser. The only problem was, it was kind of lacking on damage. And now that's absolutely been solved. One very interesting thing to note, Creeping Frost has overtaken Vortex as the main skill. Personally, I think the reason for this is Creeping Frost just has better damage projection. With Vortex, you really need to stand on top of enemies, which means enemies are standing on top of you, and potentially that enemies can hit you. With Creeping Frost, you'll fire it ahead of you, and if enemies try to charge you, they'll run right through your damage over time puddle and absolutely melt. Of course, Vortex is still in the main links, but it's more of a passive damage on left click for bosses and other really tanky stuff than something that you want to use as your main go-to. I think there is an argument to be made for Wintertide Brand as well. Wintertide Brand has absolutely amazing clear, better even than Creeping Frost. However, Wintertide Brand requires investment, and Creeping Frost doesn't. Now, leaving hardcore behind and flicking over to softcore trade, we're already seeing some people adopt the Uberdan strat. Right here, we've got a very nice Cold Dot Ascendant, who's using Eye of Malice, going low life with Coward's Legacy, and overall has, I would say, a reasonably defensive setup, but with quite a bit more damage. I mean, 3900 life isn't all that impressive in and of itself, but with secondary defensive layers, I could see this being at least decently survivable. Though personally, I'd probably want a little bit more than 3900. One tech that I do find quite nice is the Legacy of Fury Boots. Not only does this give you pseudo-pop clear, at least assuming you kill enemies that are nearby, but it makes Eye of Malice much more effective because now you're using Frostbite, Elemental Weakness, and of course Scorch, all of which lower enemy resistances. The only way to get more negative is to do all of this on an Elementalist, which is exactly what a lot of people are doing. Whether it's an Elementalist or an Ascendant, I think Cold Dot's stronger than it's been in a while, and honestly more varied than it's been in a while. If you take nothing else away from this, the one key thing to remember is curses are stronger than they've ever been in Path of Exile's history. So you should probably be running 2 of them, if not 3 of them. And that's what we're seeing here. Though one thing I am a little bit skeptical of is the cruelty support. I'm not sure if this build ends up actually hitting hard enough to make that worthwhile. Next up, we have Caustic Arrow, and/or Caustic Arrow Death's Oath. Right now, Righteous Fire is kind of a dominant, somewhat tanky map clear build. But Death's Oath isn't all that far behind in terms of clear. In fact, with Caustic Arrow, I'd argue it's ahead. It won't have the defenses of an RF Jug, but it will have comparable damage, especially because there's a good chance RF will get hit with a Nerf bat in the near future. Caustic Arrow lets you clear the entire screen really easily, and Death's Oath pretty much turns your build into a running simulator. So let's look at some details. I feel like this setup is a pretty good balance between damage and quality of life. We've got 1.3 mil Caustic Arrow dot and an unmeasurable amount on Death's Oath. As it turns out, PoE Ninja isn't very good at calculating it, and I'm not sure POB is all that much better. In terms of other interesting choices, one thing that I'm noticing on more and more builds is Impresence. This is because, again, curses got buffed, there's a lot more reasons to have them, and while personally I'd probably want a defensive curse on my Impresence rather than an offensive one, I definitely see the value in using it. The way I'd probably do this is, instead of having Asenaths, I'd have some other pair of gloves, then I'd throw in Temp Chains with Solstice Vigil, and I'd probably run Despair either as a curse on hit ring, or if I can't get that, since let's be honest, this ring's probably as good as you're gonna get, I'd probably just have it as a corruption on gloves. Maybe use some Hands of a High Templar and really juice up gem levels of something else. One other tech that I'm seeing more and more in mapping builds is Death Rush. Being able to gain adrenaline on demand is absolutely spectacular, and recovering 4% life on kill will add up faster than you know. It won't stop you from getting one-shot, and this build is definitely within the range where elemental damage could potentially one-shot it. However, we're using Viridi's Veil, which means that the damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky. Plus, we've got Temp Chains up most if not all of the time, which means enemies are going to be really slow, and the physical defenses aren't bad. Plus, with Molten Shell up, most hit damage isn't going to be too threatening. Between that and the additional bonuses from Adrenaline, this is going to feel like a super speedy mapper. Think RF or even CF Glad. Finally, I did want to come down to the Cluster Jewels to talk about one more thing that often gets overlooked, which is Unwaveringly Evil. Unwaveringly Evil isn't all that impressive if you just look at its damage stats. However, it has one bonus that personally I think is invaluable, which is you can't be interrupted by stuns when using Chaos skills. So let's say you attack a bunch of enemies, and they're all ranged enemies, so they also attack you. In theory, you might get stunned, especially with a life pool of around 5,000. However, your Caustic Arrow will still go off, and because you have around 1.3 mil DPS, that means that entire pack is now dead. Therefore, they're not going to keep hitting you, therefore your life on kill from your Death Rush can kick in, and all of a sudden, you'll be sitting pretty. Yes, you got stunned, yeah, it probably felt a little bit bad to have your movement interrupted, but instead of getting stunned and dying, this build leverages multiple synergies to instead ensure that you'll survive. I don't really think this is much of a boss killer, or at least personally, I'd still go with the RF Jug even if the damage ends up getting nerfed further. However, if you want to zoom around maps, this is going to feel very fast, and honestly, it's not so squishy that you're going to have a bad time when killing pinnacle bosses. I'd just keep it away from Ubers. Of course, this isn't the only way to build Caustic Arrow. You can also go with a pretty standard kind of damage over time Caustic Arrow setup, or you can go with a Poison Caustic Arrow setup. Now, out of all of these, I think the Poison Caustic Arrow is the most mechanically interesting, but which is the most effective? Well, that kind of comes down to what you're doing. Poison Caustic Arrow will have better bossing damage, at the cost of having to deal with totem mechanics. Whereas something like the Occultist will be much better at mapping and can even go MF, and should probably be kept away from bosses. If I was going to play Poison Caustic Arrow, I'd definitely do it on a Trickster. You already get amazing defenses from Darkscorn, you get plenty of damage from the Covenant, and Trickster just feels great. I actually think Poison Caustic Arrow got almost as many buffs as every other form. Sure, you're not going to be stacking your Caustic Arrows, but even on a 5-link like this, it's more than sufficient to clear a map. And that coverage is really all you need, especially if you're leveraging explodey effects via something like Oriath's End. But unlike a lot of the other versions of Caustic Arrow, when you do get to a single target and plop your ballistas down, trust me, that fight is not going to be lasting very long. And finally, the build that I think is most likely to completely annihilate the meta, or get completely annihilated by patch notes in 3.21, is Poison Summon Raging Spirit. If you want to know more about the Poison Summon Raging Spirit in detail, Valormage has some excellent videos on his channel, one of which will be linked in the card right now. However, on the offhand that Poison SRS is annihilated, there's something interesting to be learned here, which is that minion poison has been kind of sleeper OP for a couple of leagues now. It was buffed, but minions overall were nerfed, and so people felt like minion poison wasn't good, and minions weren't good, so they just didn't try it. There's a few core items to the build that I really wouldn't do this without. The first of which is, well, United in Dream. It's really important to get your minion poison churns capped without using a chess piece. The reason you want to use Covenant is, well, look at that. Level 29 added chaos damage gives an absolutely massive, one could even say completely absurd amount. It wouldn't surprise me if this is how the build gets nerfed, with the 29 being taken down to a more reasonable level, like 26 or even 23. 23 would, by the way, be about equivalent to an Awakened gem, whereas 29 is, I think, about double the damage of an Awakened gem. Another really important aspect for minion poison is Amanamu's Gaze. Minions have plus 6% to damage over time multiplier per ghastly eye jewel affecting you, up to a maximum of 30%. The reason this is important is, unlike a player who can just take more damage over time multiplier from sources like Gear, Watcher's Eye, and the Tree, minions have very limited sources of it, and it is a multiplier. So think of this as minions deal 30% more damage with poison. And that's the other important thing. We're not talking about a minion here, or two minions. We're talking about 20 summon Raging Spirits, each of which are poisoning the enemy. I've been watching a bit of Valormage's stream, and a lot of people have asked him, how much damage do you do? Realistically, the answer is yes. It's not how much damage do you do, it's how much health does the enemy have, because the enemy's probably going to run out of health before you run out of damage. This is because you have to constantly resummon your SRS, and the SRS have to hit an enemy to ramp the poisons up. But of course, damage is no good if you're dead before you can get it out, especially damage that has a ramp time. Which is why I really like what Valormage has done with his setup. First off, he's suppress capped, and spell suppression is incredibly powerful. So powerful that on my Wave of Conviction Ignite Elementalist, I'm still using an Elevore just to make sure I'm capped. Second of all, he's Elemental Ailment immune. This means he's not going to get taken out by a random crit because he was inflicted with Brittle. He's not going to get scorched and exposed and then end up dead due to having undercapped resistances. And he's not going to have to fear bosses. Spell suppression is the most powerful defensive layer that you can bring to a boss fight. And so long as you have infinite damage, you might as well focus on your survival above all else. But he takes it a step further, and this is where the build gets really cool. We also have Divine Shield, Eldritch Battery, and Mind Over Matter with Aegis Aurora. In other words, Valormage's Energy Shield is not only being used instead of mana, something that makes sense because SRS is quite expensive, but it's going to be constantly regenerating and constantly being recovered every time he blocks. With the roomies up, something that should happen at least constantly while mapping, most of the time during boss fights, plus Bone Offering, he should be blocking very consistently, and in fact, from me watching the stream, he is indeed blocking very consistently. The reason I feel like this build has by far the most potential to completely take over and destroy the meta is you can League start as a different version of SRS and transfer into this later. The build has absurd damage, and it's absurdly tanky. Plus, there isn't a type of content that it isn't good in. You want to go fight bosses? It can do it. You want to run Simulacrum? It can do it. You want to run Blighted maps? Well, I haven't tried that, I haven't seen Valor try it, but I'm sure it can do it. You want to do the Sanctum? You can do it. This build does everything, and in that way, it kind of reminds me of Cast on Crit Forbidden Right. Now, is the quality of life here quite as nice as some other builds? Not quite, but close enough that I don't think I'd be complaining personally. And so, there's three things that I want you to take away from this build. Number one, even if SRS is nerfed, consider Minion Poison. Number two, even if Minion Poison is nerfed, consider SRS. And number three, layer your defensive mechanics, because odds are your build does enough damage, and it'll feel a lot better if you're not dying. Consider something like Spell Suppression plus Recovery on Block. And if you want to know about a completely different way to leverage Spell Suppression and Recovery on Block, get subscribed, while you're down there leave a like, because that's what I'm going to be talking about in an upcoming video when I showcase my build. For now though, if you want to see how this works, do check out BalorMage's channel. He has some absolutely excellent content covering all the details. Now again, I'm not a fortune teller, so I can't predict the future. But I do think all of these builds have the potential to thrive in the current meta. Creeping Frost has kind of been sitting just below the top 10 for a while now, and it got nothing but buffs from the recent changes to curses. Poison Caustic Arrow was already a solid build and also got quite a lot of buffs from the changes in 320. Especially since Vol Caustic Arrow really does round out its clear. And lots of people love the Death Stuff variant, even though personally that's probably not my cup of tea. And I would be surprised if Poison SRS either wasn't nerfed or didn't take over the meta in 321. It's just a little bit too strong. And no, I don't just mean the ridiculous numbers that you see people pad out their POBs with. I've seen bosses dying on Valor's stream. This one is the real deal. But I'm curious, what other builds do you think might take over the meta? And what currently meta builds do you think might not be around as of 321? It was kind of hard to make this list, because there were several other things that weren't quite this good, but were still strong enough that I could absolutely see them as a contender. Now, maybe I'm biased because I played it for the last couple weeks, but I do think my Wave of Conviction Ignite Elementalist is a contender here. It's got really solid defenses, bossing has felt great on it, mapping feels great because, well, it's Ignite with Prolif, what's there not to like? And it's the sort of build you can play from day 1 to day 90 of a league, a true character for all occasions. Something else I was considering covering, which didn't quite make the cut, was Spark Inquisitor. This is because Spark Inquisitor's kind of already been the meta, though it's never been quite as meta as it is now due to the new interaction with the Nimbus Ring. Though who knows, that may be a topic for another video. But for now, be sure to leave your guesses as to what builds might take over, or fall out of a meta as of 321 down in the comments below. And before I get going, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. And if you're looking for something else to watch, YouTube should have a recommendation on screen right now, or you can check out some of our resources in the card, including the mechanics on how Wave of Conviction works, and of course, more information on BalorMage's Poison SRS build. That's all for me today, but I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.